of an extended introduction because of some news that we've had. So thanks to everyone for coming down in the pouring rain for this. We just found out that this is a sold out event, which is very exciting. Thank you. Well done for doing that. We're so grateful to you. This wouldn't exist without you, and we're so grateful for your support. So with our deepest regrets and apologies, due to unforeseen circumstances, 2 of our panelists can't be here today. Unfortunately, Lola Keeley is unwell, and we wish her the speediest recovery, and I know that you support us in that. Adiba Jaigirdar, unfortunately, has been trying desperately to get here all day. She was on a plane at 10 a.m. this morning in Dublin, but unfortunately, flights and the weather have meant that the plane was delayed and then had to turn around at the last moment. So she is unable to be here. She's given her permission for a reading to be done in her stead, and so we're happy to be able to honor her work in that way. We still have a gorgeous event lined up for you. Lex Croucher and Anahit Behrooz are here today. But yeah, just wanted to let you know we're really sorry, but we are excited to chat about the radical potential of romance with our panelist Lex Croucher today. So give Lex and Anahit a big hand of applause, please.
Is my microphone on?
Is my microphone on? Yes,
Ooh.
Okay. Whoa. A lot of mics on.
Miking too close to each other.
Yeah, I think we need to
stay as far away from each other as possible.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to First Date, the first romance festival in Edinburgh. As you have heard, there have been some hiccups, but we are very excited to have Lex here.
I'm the entire panel.
Lex is the panel. Lex and I have been increasingly hysterical in the green room for the past, hour, so that's the energy that you can expect.
Yep.
Happy Pride, everyone. I'm very excited that we're doing a very queer romance panel on the last day of Pride. If you were at Pride yesterday and you're here today, you're braver than the troops.
Done.
Good for you.
I'm so glad you say braver than the troops too, because I say it all the time, I always think I'm going to get in so much trouble when I say it. Because someone will turn around and be like, actually, I served in Nam or whatever.
Yeah, no.
Is that something people still say? I don't know.
I think, that's a timeline we don't need to.
So this is the kind of energy that you're going to have today.
So I'm going to do a short reading from Adiba's beautiful book. I'm going to cosplay as a fiction author for the first time and last time in my life, since the Harry Potter fan fiction I wrote when I was 14. So this is my return to form. And then Lex and I are going to have a little chat, and then there will be audience questions at the end.
I like there will be. Not like there is an opportunity to ask.
No, I'm looking at all of you.
There will be audience questions.
Directly in the eyes. Think of them now. Okay, so this is from Adiba's recent book, The Do's and Donuts of Love. I'm going to read from the back. Shireen Malik is still reeling from a breakup when she hears that she'll be a contestant on a TV baking competition. As well as the prize money, she hopes the buzz will bring some attention to her parents' beloved donut shop. But things grow complicated when Shireen learns that her ex-girlfriend Chris is also on the show. Then there's Neve, a fellow contestant who Shireen finds herself quickly growing close to. As the competition heats up, Shireen will have to put her feelings aside if she wants a sweet victory. It is as cute as it sounds. I finished it yesterday. So, chapter 1, This Cookie Won't Crumble. I know things are bad when even donuts betray me. Because there I am, sitting on my bed, rewatching every episode of The Great British Bake Off on Netflix. A box of 6 donuts from You Drive Me Glazy on my bedside table. 6 donuts that I helped Amu and Abu create. And the moment I bite into the first, chocolate hazelnut filling gushes out all over the front of my shirt. I can only groan and pull myself off the bed, where I'd finally found a comfortable position. The judges of Great British Bake Off are on my laptop screen, explaining the challenge to the contestants. But I'm a little too busy slipping out of my gross chocolate-stained shirt to pay attention. My phone buzzes by the box of donuts, and my heart almost leaps out of my chest. Tossing my shirt on the floor, I lunge towards the phone, hoping, but it's just a text from Fatima. Fatima, can I call? I don't reply. Instead, I slip on a new shirt, one without any stains on it, close the lid of my laptop, and hit video call. Fatima picks up almost immediately. There's a grin on her face, but she says, "You look terrible," as a greeting. There's something almost delirious about that being accompanied by Fatima's delighted expression. I pull a face and tug at the strands of my hair, trying to shift them into something that doesn't make it obvious that I've spent the past few days barely moving from under my duvet cover. Thanks, Fatima. Sorry, but she doesn't sound particularly sorry as she flicks away a strand of her long, ink-black hair out of her eyes. Are you still in bed? There's an accusatory note to her voice, so I try to fill the whole screen with my face so she can't see that not only am I in bed, but that my bed is also a mess. Plus the half a dozen donuts still by my bedside. No. I obviously don't sound very believable because Fatima lets out a frustrated puff of air. Shireen, I know things haven't been easy, but you can't just, She waves her hands around her like that's supposed to indicate something. But somehow I know exactly what she means. Why did you want to call? I ask, instead of addressing Fatima's pretty valid points. Because I read your blog post, Fatima says. Oh, yeah. She leans forward so I can almost see up her nostril. Not a pleasant sight by any means, but considering I've known Fatima pretty much since I came out of the womb, not an unfamiliar sight either. First of all, I hope you save me some cookie dough brownie ice cream sandwiches because it's so bloody hot here that just the thought of them made me seriously consider buying a plane ticket and fleeing this country. Fati, she holds up a finger to silence me. But second, and most important, you can't tell people in your blog that you're not going to crumble because of your breakup, but then spend all of your time in your bed watching what? Episodes of The Great British Bake Off? She raises an eyebrow, and I'm annoyed that she's guessed exactly how I've spent the past few weeks. Ever since... But that's the last thing I want to think about, even though it's difficult to not think about it. And it's definitely the last thing I want to talk about. The Great British Bake Off makes me feel better, I say defensively. In fact, with Fatima gone to Bangladesh for the summer and my ex suddenly out of the picture, it's the only thing that makes me feel better. Well, that and donuts when they're not leaking out all over my shirt. You know what else makes people feel better? Fatima asks. Getting out of bed, going outside, taking in the sun, hanging out with real life people, not people inside your computer screen. First of all, living in Ireland means taking in the sun is not an option. And second, Nadia Hussain, the only successful Bangladeshi person in the food industry, is a real life person, even if she is inside my computer screen. And she's way more inspiring and motivating than any real life person can be. Even me, Fatima asks, though I know from the almost inhuman screech in her voice that she's not being serious. I roll my eyes. Okay, not counting you. She smiles, though there's still a little bit of worry in her eyes. You can't spend the whole summer like this, Shireen, she says after a moment. Softer this time, so I know she's really worried about me. When there's really nothing to worry about, because I'm okay, or I'm going to be. Like I declared in my blog post, this cookie, and I'm the cookie, won't crumble, even if it might get a bit disheveled. That was very cute. I felt like I was doing story time.
You did some great
nice.
voice acting
God,
as well,
you.
like little moments of,
Oh, that was so nice. So this is for sale upstairs along with a lot of Adiba's other books. It is just so charming. It's so nice, like just reading something nice. I read so many sad books. This is not sad. It's a good time. So, on to you.
On to me.
Our
This feels
three
like,
panelists.
the episode of Friends where they all order food and then leave the restaurant and he's like, you boys are about to see something real special. Like I can't promise it's going to be that special, but I'm going to try.
So why don't we begin with you introducing yourself? Who are you, Lex?
Hi, I'm Lex Croucher, all three panelists for this panel. I write historical-ish books, so I have written 3 adult Regency books, which are kind of romances, they have elements of romance to them. The first one's called Reputation, and then Infamous came out last year, and Trouble is exclusively here. You can only buy it here because it's not out until the 20th of July. So this is actually my first time really seeing it properly. One arrived at my house yesterday, and I was so busy, I just went, I don't care about this, I'm going to Scotland, bye. And Gwen and Art Are Not in Love is my first YA novel. That came out in May. It is also kind of historical, but it's something that I like to call, it's not historical fantasy, but it's fantasy historical, which means I can do what I like because there's no rules. It's the fantasy of history.
Nice. And what was it that got you into romance writing?
Well, first of all, I just sort of challenged myself to write a book and thought, I didn't think I could do it, basically. So I had spent my entire childhood and kind of teenage years reading a lot of romance YA. Although I do think that YA, sorry, this is going to become a TED talk now for me. YA didn't really exist in this country in the way that it, and then things like Twilight, I feel like really just kind of, thank you, Twilight.
And John Green did
yes.
something.
Oh yeah, exactly. It completely changed the landscape, because I think it just didn't really exist. There was one YA publisher when I was a teenager called Bite. I don't know if anybody remembers. And it had, and Sarah Manning, who I love, had a bunch of books out on Byte. See, again, this is just a speech now. Did anyone read Guitar Girl? Yeah, changed my entire life. Literally changed my life, because also I was in a band at the time, and Guitar Girl is like the kind of classic music story of like, I got into a band for the right reasons, and then the music industry crushed my soul, and I thought that's what was happening to me at 14, because I just thought I was a really cool rock star, and in fact, me and the bassist did quit our band due to artistic integrity, which
of you had the integrity and which didn't?
I don't know. I can't remember who decided to develop integrity first, but we had a manager, and by that I mean like a guy who tried to be in a band and then it didn't work out, so then he was teaching kids how to be in a band. He was nice, I promise. This feels like it's going in a bad direction. But it was the kind of thing where like he was just tricking parents, like middle-class parents, into like paying loads of money for their kids to be in rock bands, because that's all you wanted to do when you were like 13. And it was genius. It was like the best business move. So I had a manager who my parents were paying, and but they basically, we nearly had our big break, and someone came who had worked with the Spice Girls, and I know, and listened to our EP that we were recording. Again, I don't know where this money came from for this EP, the bank of mum and dad, I guess, at the time, very bizarre. And said like, this is good, but it's not pop enough. And so then the manager started trying to write our songs. And that's when I was like, no way, man. Like, the songs are too important to me. Meanwhile, the songs were the equivalent of just like, yeah, I don't like going to school, wow. What was your question?
I think it was for you to introduce yourself, which I think you've done.
Oh, no, it was about getting into romance writing. So anyway, the point is, Guitar Girl, huge for me, big moment. But I always wanted to write kind of like fun YA, and I actually ended up moving kind of more towards adult, just because when I tried to pitch my first adult book to publishers, they were like, this isn't YA. They take 8 different types of drug in this book. You can only have one type of drug in a YA book. So that ended up kind of being aged up a little bit into adult. But yeah, it was really kind of YA and more kind of coming of age stories that had elements of romance were the things that really interested me about writing, because that was just the stuff that I loved when I was a teenager. And I think also I write the books that I want to write and the stories that I want to write, and then afterwards someone tells me what they are. And so people will go like, oh, that's like a rom-com. And I'm like, whatever you say, I guess I write rom-coms now. So that's how I got into writing romance.
Okay.
Accidentally, almost.
That was so comprehensive.
If anybody wants to know my blood type or anything afterwards, like I can just keep talking.
They will tell you.
Yeah.
So this panel is obviously about like the radical potential of romance fiction. And all of your books, sorry, I just noticed my book.
Yeah, your book's here too. Why don't you introduce yourself, please?
No.
Oh.
That's my book. That's it. But we're talking about the radical potential of romance fiction. And I think with all of your books, they are historical, they're Regency, but they have queer characters, queer narratives, people of color. Gwen has someone that's half Iranian. I'm Iranian. So I was like, very like, oh, that's nice. I think I literally took a picture and sent it to Christina. And I was like, look, it's very exciting. And I'm curious about whether you are aware of the politics of the narrative as you're writing. Kind of what comes first? Or is it just a case of those things are so enmeshed?
I think they're very enmeshed. I think also, obviously you make a conscious decision with something like Regency romance. It's like an incredibly white genre and also an incredibly straight genre, kind of, or like has been until recently, when there's actually a lot more kind of authors writing these stories. But I think it's actually quite a hard question to answer, because recently my feelings about it have changed as I've been writing the books. And so I've reached the point where I've written 3 Regency books. And yes, I tried to be very considered in the approach, and I was kind of like, oh, well, I can have this be a world with queer people in it and just do what I want with that story. But I've reached the point where I'm especially sick of writing about like rich people and like privileged people in Regency, because my first 2 books are kind of like, I want to hang out with the cool party kids and they're all really wealthy. And then my second book was kind of middle class-ish people going off to spend time with horrible rich people. All the rich people are horrible, if that helps. But I just reached the point, and I feel like the way that I'm writing now and the things that will be coming out after these books, where I'm just like, I don't want to write about these people anymore. And I don't like Regency. It to me, like the appeal of Regency was the kind of ridiculousness of the kind of structure and the rules, and like it's also a time that's very ingrained on people's imaginations in the UK. I feel like people, if you mentioned another time period, people might be like, oh, I don't really know much about that. I was never like a huge Regency specific fanatic. It was more that I was just like, that's a very vivid time period that people kind of understand. And obviously like Austen's quite like a, you know, she cuts through. Well done, Austen. A lot of cut through. You've hit your KPIs. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. So the answer to your question is I do think a lot about it while I'm writing. It is obviously all very intentional, but I also think that I almost, me from like 4 years ago, who started writing, 4 years ago? I've lost all sense of time. Who started writing my first Regency book, like I feel like I'm a whole world apart from that person now, and the stuff that I want to write in the future, like I don't really want to write any more Regency. I feel like I've just kind of reached that. This book is about a working class governess who hates children. She's not actually a governess. See, I'm pitching it great already. She's not a governess, she hates children. It's about someone who steps in for her sister who is unwell and goes to be a governess at a fancy rich house in her place. But she hates kids and she hates rich people. So it goes really well for her.
It sounds like Sexy Sound of Music, which is already
sexy. Sound of Music.
So like...
Well, I don't know how sexy... Well, yeah, I was going to say, you can't get any sexier than Sound of Music. So, like, I actually don't know how anyone would top that. It was very much, I pitched it as like Sound of Music, but what if the nun was evil and not a nun? Which obviously all of publishing was like, great, sounds wonderful. But I immediately forgot what I was going to say.
That's okay.
That's going to happen a lot. I'm
right.
3 people right now, I'm sorry. I've only got one person's amount of words inside me.
Doing all the work. That's okay. I have more questions. So
oh my
I can,
God.
Like, propel the conversation.
It just asked me about my teenage years in a band, and apparently I'll just keep
hour.
going for an hour. Yeah, exactly.
So you kind of talked about how like the Regency exists like really large in the British imagination. And even though it is like a period that can be quite stuffy, is very white, you are writing kind of queerness, you are writing people of color, as we said, even kind of like different class dynamics. And I'm interested in like this approach. Do you see writing as an act of like historic revisionism? And what do you think can be radical about that sort of historic revisionism?
I feel like these are such good questions, and I also feel like I need to like write an essay in response.
So you can just say things.
I'll just say things and see what comes out of my mouth. That'll be fun for everyone. I think that I don't want it to feel like this kind of made up version of history is kind of an act of erasing like what actually happened. And I think a lot of the time, so like the research that I was doing around the Regency books, actually I can't even keep one thought straight in my head. One of the things that came up a lot when I first started writing Regency was that all my reviews were like, this is so unrealistic. Like author takes huge liberties with history. And I'm like, in terms of things like jokes and putting Mean Girls references in, yes, true. Like I cannot deny those allegations. I did put Mean Girls references in my first book, and there are memes in some of my books which I think some people love and some people absolutely hate. I actually saw someone be like, there is a Riverdale reference in Gwen and Art Not in Love. Like literally, how did the author think they could get away with this? I was like, I'm not trying to get away with anything.
It's so good.
Yeah, like that was very intentional. But I think a lot of the time people believe that the historical inaccuracy is having any characters who aren't white, or having any queer characters having being allowed to experience even like the tiniest crumb of joy, they're just like, that's not realistic.
Yeah.
And obviously that's just not true. Like if like anyone who has done like even the basics of research into the time period would know that there was more diversity than people kind of imagine the Regency being. And I think maybe it's come a bit more into the kind of public awareness with things like Gentleman Jack and Anne Lister, like the fact that, you know, she was living not as an out lesbian, but as a kind of member of society where people were like, there's something weird going on here. Like, or, you know, she uses the wrong type of umbrella. It was one of the things that came up a lot. It's like different kinds of umbrella handle. And there was like a mannish one, and she used like the masculine umbrella. Anyway. So I feel like people are kind of beginning to realize that actually the Regency was not how we kind of, how people have imagined it in the past. So in answer to your question, kind of, as in I do take a bit more kind of liberties with things like just having people be more comfortable in their kind of communities within the books. Yeah. So a lot of the time it's that people can be who they are and kind of live without a lot of kind of prejudice or hate within these communities that they've formed and within friendship groups and stuff. But every time you write a note, I feel like I'm in therapy. You're like, that's so interesting. There's something terribly wrong with you.
I just have such a bad memory.
Also just tells you exactly what I'm thinking therapy is. I'm just like, oh, I'm getting a bad mark in therapy.
I can give these notes to you afterwards if you want to show them
0 out of 10.
to a therapist.
Thank you very much. That would be greatly appreciated. Yes. Wow, I don't know what I was saying.
That's
See,
okay.
This is the problem. As soon as I distract myself, it's all over. Oh, yes, people within their kind of communities living without prejudice, because I feel like, first of all, I do feel like that's realistic, and I don't necessarily feel like that's kind of revisionism. Is that how I would say that word? See, I'm feeling very smart today. And also just because they are ultimately my books, and I get to do what I like. And if I'm going to take liberties with putting Mean Girls references in, I'm also going to be like, well, I choose for this story not to just be entirely about like hatred being thrown at every character, and they're just going to have mostly a nice time.
Yeah. This is like a thought that I'm having literally right now, so it might be bad. But that kind of idea, like that phrase, like taking liberty, like isn't liberty kind of the point? In a way, like
you're
isn't
right.
that idea of like freedom?
Stealing freedom.
Yeah, like that's a nice thing, surely. I don't know why it's become like such a bad, kind of an indication of something that you've done wrong.
That's a good thought.
Oh my God.
You get 10 out of 10 for therapy.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it is really interesting, that idea of the historical record. I thought of it a lot in Trouble. Was that the second one?
Trouble's the most recent one. Infamous is the
thank
bright
you.
yellow cover Poets on an Island.
With Infamous, which I'm not going to spoil, but that has a very like queer relationship in it. And I was like, how is this going to be resolved? And then it turns out that it's resolved in ways that there are just gaps in historical records, right?
Yes.
That there are ways of writing things that we now read and it's like, oh, that didn't happen. But actually it was like almost like a coda for like certain kinds of relationships, which is exciting to kind of retrieve from the silences, I think. Yeah, that wasn't really a question. That was just
Loved
a
it.
thought. Thank
I liked that thought too. Well done.
Do you think there is something inherently radical about romance fiction, or is it something that requires kind of like this historic revisionism that requires intervention?
I know that there was somebody who, I'm just going to steal someone else's thought. There was a tweet a while ago about how romance is often very much kind of like belittled and looked down on. And it's kind of seen as like, because it's mostly for women, that it's like a kind of frivolous genre or whatever. And someone was talking about how romance is a genre where women get happy endings, not murdered, and not kind of just used as like a device to like move the plot on. And I think that in itself can probably be quite radical. I do think that I think that recently we're seeing a lot more people being able to write like the kind of romance stories that they want to see. And I do think that I always want to feel positive about that. I also worry about how publishing as an industry kind of realizes it's messed up, tries to correct problems, but then doesn't provide like internal support for like reaching out to a wider kind of range of authors and a wider like group of experiences. Again, this is now my TED talk on the publishing industry. because I do think we're seeing a kind of boom in in stories being told that haven't been told before, but I also worry about the kind of sustainability of that in terms of like what you want to happen is for it to reach a point where like that feels really normal and it doesn't feel like, whoa, there's this boom happening. You can actually read queer romance, or you can actually read romance by people of color. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that that is going to be sustained and we're going to reach a point where, but even now when people think there's a boom, if you look at the stats, you're like, actually there isn't really a boom. It's that thing where like men perceive that if women talk 20% of the time, or whatever, I can't remember what the stat is. It's if they talk 40% of the time or something, men think that they spoke 80% of the time or something, where you're just like, whoa, I'm not used to seeing these like stories being kind of put to the forefront. And so suddenly it's like, oh, everything. I even actually had a conversation with an author who will not be named, who was like, will not be named, who was like, oh, well, it's just so hard to sell books now as like a white person writing straight romance. And I was like, oh my God,
oh no,
that's so sad. So yeah, I think like, God, again, what was the question? I don't even know. I was just dunking on people.
Whether it's like inherently radical.
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
I think people are doing very radical things within the romance genre now. And I also think that, yeah, it can be quite radical to be kind of honest about experiences and also tell stories that aren't just kind of like very sanitized and fluffy about those experiences. But then I also think that, yeah, romance as a genre, like even just the fact that, yeah, it has historically mostly been for women, like there is something radical about that for sure.
Yeah, I find that idea of like the gendering of the romance audience really interesting. Because and I don't want to sound like kind of men's rights activist. So
what are you going to say? I'm so excited.
But I think that would be something really radical about writing romance for men, right? Because that would really trouble certain ideas of like masculinity and the kind of things that men read, right?
Yes.
Do you kind of have a particular audience in mind? Are you kind of writing for like, when you write, do you have it in mind that you're largely writing for women, for queer people? Is that kind of part of your writing process? And is that something that you're trying to maybe push into?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I think that the problem is I'm writing for me, and that's why when people are like, I don't like this Riverdale joke, I'm like, well, I don't care. I thought it was funny to make a joke about Riverdale. So ultimately, I do feel like I'm writing for I am my audience, and I am like a queer, non-binary 31-year-old. God, time just keeps ticking.
Yeah, it doesn't stop.
It just keeps going. Yeah, exactly. And so I feel like that is kind of the audience that I have in mind, is people like me. But I also think that when I started writing my kind of historical books, they were put under women's fiction. They were marketed as women's fiction, and I don't think they're women's fiction, and not that there's anything wrong with women's fiction, but I think that there are just kind of parts of the genre that are expected. It's actually the same with romance, in that I would say, not to be controversial at this romance panel, but I would probably say that my books don't hit some of the romance beats, like a lot of the romance beats. So I've forgotten the question again. This is just outrageous.
No, you don't have to like bring it back to the question every time.
Thank
God.
God.
You can just say things.
I went to a mashed potato bar before this, and that was like obviously a huge mistake because I'm just full of mashed potato and there's just nothing in my head except mashed potato. So it was really good though.
You said that you weren't hitting like romance beats.
I'm not hitting romance beats. So I don't know if my audience is the typical romance audience either. And I especially think that some people are so horrified because these books especially are marketed at fans of Bridgerton, because Bridgerton, I sold my first book and it was very hard to sell because everyone was like, no one cares about the Regency anymore. Regency's just not in fashion. I was like, okay. So it took us like a really long time to sell the book, and we went out to a lot of publishers and we got a lot of rejection. And in the end, we got a deal where we were just kind of like, this is our only offer. And then 6 months later, Bridgerton came out. and it just, I think the book sold in like 13 languages or something, which is just unheard of for like a debut. Well, not unheard of, it happens, but it wasn't expected for that to happen. So I owe a huge personal debt to Bridgerton. I keep smacking my microphone, I'm sure that sounds great. But the thing that I've been trying to do recently is to put off the Bridgerton. Did I do that? Wow. Magic. The thing that I've been trying to do recently is put off the Bridgerton audience a little bit, which is probably a bad marketing technique, and everyone at my publisher's probably like, why are you doing this? But because my books aren't sort of classic romances, so that this book opens with the line, there was shit on the heel of Emily's boot. And I feel like a lot of Bridgerton people will be like, no, thank you, that's not for me. And I'll be like, good, okay. So now we've established that the word shit is in the first line of the book, and we can move on from there. So I don't know if I'm even, writing for the kind of romance audience. I don't know who I'm writing for. Just me. I'm going to keep trying to fix this because it's definitely my fault.
That's okay. I think,
If I just stay very still.
If you don't move a muscle,
then
it'll be fine. So you kind of talked a lot about writing about like neglected characters, neglected love stories that haven't been part of, I suppose, both the romance canon, but just generally the historical canon, just how we conceive of these things. And I think there is a real kind of thorniness to the representation politics debate, right? Where I think some people kind of take representation politics as the end goal. That if something is quote unquote diverse, that's kind of the job is done. And, and there's a big thing in kind of literary studies, that kind of argument between diversity and decolonization. So how do we kind of structurally change things? What are some of the ways that you kind of are trying to engage with the genre that both includes kind of diverse stories, but also maybe goes beyond that?
So I think, is my microphone still on? I don't know what I'm doing anymore. So I think that the number one thing for me is that we've had a lot of, and I love books like this, but I feel like the first kind of books that were allowed, or like kind of were getting the marketing spend and the push and stuff, were very much issues-led books and kind of coming out stories, and just kind of stories about people coming to terms with their gender identity and things like that. And I love those books, but I also think that for me, what I really want to see going forward is just like queer books across all genres, where it's not kind of that you're just like, this is a diverse book and it's about kind of an issue. Because I think that once you have a mix of both of those types of books, where you can be like, this is an issues-led book, or this is a book about this particular experience, but then you can also have, here's queer books in space, or, like just things that kind of, where you, I say queer books in space.
Is that Taz's book?
Yeah,
is that what you're thinking of?
Listen, as soon as I said queer books in space, and I'm just like, lesbian necromancers on a haunted palace in space. My favorite book of all time. You're like, everyone here knows what you're talking about. You don't have to explain. Sometimes I just, at these events, people don't know, or some people don't know, and then I do my Tamsin Muir TED
she's
talk.
So cool. She is so cool. She is married to a guy I knew at uni, so I've like met her.
Well, we're going to talk afterwards.
Yeah, she's so fucking great.
I know that she lives in Oxford. I'm just like, I should stop. This is just making me look really creepy. Anytime I go to Oxford, I'm like, anywhere? Anyway, the point is that, what is the point? Yes, I'm excited for a point at which like books across like all genres and all kind of subject matter and stuff have enough kind of voices writing them that it doesn't have to be a kind of like, if you want a book about being sort of like queer in high school or whatever, the only thing you can have is a kind of like, here's your coming out story. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Now I'm thinking about Tamsin Muir.
Like
we all are, yeah.
All the time.
All the time.
All the time. I think it's really interesting as well, that kind of idea of the coming of age, that idea of like a teleology almost, that you were trying to end up at something. And I think it's really interesting with your books that there are happy endings, but the happy endings aren't always necessarily just romantic.
I thought you were going to say they aren't always happy. I was like, well, that's true.
But they're not always just romantic. Like there's a lot of, this is just like a personal like topic that I love, obviously. But there's a lot about like friendship, community, about like different forms of relation as well, which I think is really, like you're thinking about queerness not only as kind of a one-on-one monogamous relationship, but as like a community building, as like queering intimacy, I suppose. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I actually often say that the love story in Gwen and Arthur Not in Love is between Gwen and Arthur, who do not get together. Like the title is not, some people think that the title's like, they're not in love? Oh, they are in love. I'm like, no, they're actually not in love. They are in love as friends. Yeah. Like that.
It's enemies to friends, which is very sexy.
Well,
and
it's like enemies. It's like enemies to reluctant allies covering for each other to friends.
Yeah.
Is there a way I can fix this microphone? Does anyone up there know? What have I done wrong?
It might be where it's plugged with
Oh. It's in my butt pocket. Well, let's just see if that helps. I sort of twiddled the wire a bit. Yes, no. So what were we saying?
Gwen and Art.
Gwen and Art, yes. So they actually, in Gwen and Art, Not in Love, all the romance beats are hit with the two of them. Mm-hmm. So you have like this kind of, the first, because they're kind of childhood enemies, you have their kind of first meeting again, which is like a anti-meet cute of just like having to see each other again. And then you have things like the first late night conversation where they actually open up to each other, and you have things like the third act breakup and stuff, but this is all happening between two friends. So I always try very hard to pitch this as like the love story is actually between these two friends. It doesn't, because especially when you write two different point of views in a book, which you should never do unless they're dating each other, because then you have to do two separate romance storylines that aren't to do with each other, which is a mistake and an error, and you should never do it. Just really fun. Those romances are actually kind of almost, they're in their infancies by the end of the book. It's not that you reach the end of the book and both of these characters have these kind of fully fledged romances where you're like, this is the happy ending for those relationships. Those relationships are actually kind of almost only just starting out. And the relationship that has come to its kind of like, we are happy and we're going to be happy together is the relationship between Gwen and Art.
Which is beautiful.
Thanks.
It's nice. I want to talk about Gwen and Art a little bit more because it is technically your most recent book because Trouble is in the future.
This doesn't
exist.
Yet.
It's not real.
You can't see it.
Yeah. It's not here. But it is also your first young adult book technically because there were too many drugs in other books.
Too many drugs, yeah.
Not that many drugs in Gwen and Art. So
no, actually, I really feel like I'm making my books sound a lot more exciting than they are.
There are exciting.
Some drugs in
Don't
Reputation. A little. Actually, though, they take mushrooms in the next book. Never mind.
Yeah. They're very exciting.
No drugs in Trouble. So there you go.
But yeah, I'm interested in what it was about writing for a younger audience that you wanted to do, and I suppose what is radical about like introducing particularly this kind of romance and this kind of queer community so early on.
So I actually feel like in YA, I always felt like you could kind of have more fun and also get away with a bit more in terms of like, I think this isn't the case in all adult books. There are fun adult books, I hear. But you were saying you only read sad books, so
I read the sad girl canon.
Yes,
it's very
I was going to ask
for
if
me.
you read the kind of literary fiction.
And parody it myself.
I do love that too, actually, because also especially when I've read a bunch of YA, then when I move over, I'm just like, whoa, let's get some weird stuff going on over here. But yes, I don't know, I was obsessed with YA when I was a teenager, like the stuff that I could read. And then at the beginning of lockdown, I decided to like catch up on all the YA that I'd missed, all of it. Didn't quite read all of it, but I read a lot of books that year. I think during 2020, either you couldn't read books at all because you had such a mental block and you just like can't do anything, or you just kind of chose one thing and like went for it. And the thing I went for was just like read every book. So I read a lot of the kind of more recent like YA series, and like I hadn't read things like Six of Crows, and I hadn't read the Raven Cycle and like all these books.
I fucking love the Raven Cycle.
Yeah, it's so good.
It's so good.
So good. But yeah, so I hadn't read any of that, and so it was like really revelatory to be like, look at all this stuff that's out here. And I just wanted to be a part of that. Thought it seemed cool to be a part of it. And I think actually sometimes I do get quite terrified when I remember that like actual teenagers are going to read my books for teenagers, because you would think that's the expected outcome, but it scares me. Because teenagers are very discerning, and if they don't like something, they'll be very
very online.
Yes, and they'll probably tag you and be like, "This book was garbage. Give me my money back." But I also think that what's interesting about being an author right now is that kind of online presence and stuff. I do feel like actually a 13-year-old who picks up this book is probably quite unlikely to review it anywhere, to kind of tag me, to do anything like that. So the majority of actually young people who read books like targeted at young people, I don't think are part of the kind of online community of books or like book reviewers. And so sometimes you forget that the audience that you are really, not really writing for, because you're writing for all the audiences, but there's that kind of silent audience of teenagers who are picking up in the library and stuff that absolutely blows my mind every time I remember that they exist, or I hear like a school librarian being like, oh, we've ordered in a couple of copies and they've, you know, people are taking them out, and I'm like, oh, you shouldn't let them. This book says fucking it 4 times.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? It was not to make this about me, but I will for a second.
Please do. Oh my God. Please be the other half of the panel.
But it was something that I found with when this came out, where I was like, oh, it just exists beyond me.
Yeah.
And I had written it being like, 5 of my friends will read it, and won't it be so nice? And then you see it in places that are none of your business.
You didn't put it there.
I didn't put it
Exactly.
there. I didn't
You're like,
live in
someone
that town.
put that there.
Yeah, it's very strange. Like the idea that a book exists, it was in your head, and then it's public property.
It is very weird, yeah. And I think I wrote Gwen and Art as like a fun personal project. I never thought it would be published. And when I sent it to my very lovely agent, she was like, I love this. I don't know if I don't know if publishers are gonna buy it, but I think they should. I was like, cool, that's what you want to hear.
That's a good agent.
Yeah, I mean, she was just like, it might be a little bit of a hard sell, because I was like, okay, so it's set in Camelot, but it's about Arthur. It's not King Arthur. He's been dead for hundreds of years, but it's about a person called Arthur and a person called Gwen, but it's not Guinevere. And by that point, publishers are like, okay. So it was a bit of a weird book, and actually I wrote that it was a weird book in my acknowledgements, and somebody reviewed it and tagged me and was like, I'm glad the author said this was a weird book, because I kind of felt bad the whole time thinking, oh, this is weird. And then I got to the end and went, oh, it's okay, they know. Not news that it's a weird book. But yeah, really, really quite genuinely did not expect that book to be published, mostly because I wrote it with the kind of energy that I used to bring to my fan fiction that I used to write.
Yeah.
And so it was very much just like, this is going to be self-indulgent. It's going to be silly. I'm going to dial everything up to 11. Like, it is basically a bunch of teenagers kicking about in a castle, because I just think that's fun. Yeah. I just think that's neat. So that
it was.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's what I hope. I didn't necessarily think that people were going to read it. So that is quite scary. It's quite weird. I'm like, oh, who showed you that? It's like, well, I can buy it in a bookshop.
Yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah. Is it weird kind of writing in a genre that is so concerned with sex and pleasure, writing for children?
Like, so you're a freaky old weirdo. What are you doing?
How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, in my adult books, they're not, okay, my adult books are not very sexy. As in, I think they're sexy with the flirting, and I hope with the chemistry and the tension. My main thing is, and this will make you immediately understand why my books are not like very sex heavy, is that to me, like, jokes are the sexiest thing in the world. I said this thing ages ago that I always try and remember, because I was like, I sounded vaguely smart when I said that. It was something about how like banter to me is like flirting, and like attraction and falling for each other is like when the jokes land, when the chemistry works. That didn't sound that smart, did it?
No, it did.
Thanks. So for me, a lot of the kind of sexual tension and just romantic tension in general just come through that kind of back and forth and being able to like banter with each other and kind of play off each other. So in my books for adults, there's heavy makeout sessions, whoa. And there is kind of closed door, is that what it's called? Yeah, like closed door sex, kind of.
Like off camera.
Yeah, pan away from the bed is what I used to call it. In Infamous, and then in Trouble, I tried to be a little hornier. And I sent it to I have a writing group, and I sent it to some of the people who write like horny romance. And I was like, I've written something so filthy, so despicable. It'll change your opinion of me forever. I said it to them, and they were like, babe, this is nothing. Like, this is the most vanilla thing I've ever read.
God, that's so
like, there's not even any like descriptions of anatomy in this. I was like, my God, no. Who would do that? So it hasn't been so much of a jump for me, basically. I mean, also, there's this weird thing where with YA, teenagers, I don't know if anyone's told you, teenagers have sex. Whoa. And so it's weird when you're writing for an audience where I feel like sometimes publishing doesn't want to accept the fact that the teenagers reading the books are likely, like some of them are likely sexually active, and they're not going to be horrified by the idea of characters having sex. Especially, I mean, in Gwen and Art, they are 17 and 18. So But what was interesting is that when I was pitching that book to publishers, one publisher just turned around and said to me, like, why don't they fuck? Why don't your characters fuck? I was like,
why not?
I was like, it's just not the book I was writing. I'm sure they are somewhere. Good for them. But it's just not the book that I was necessarily writing this time. And that was really interesting coming from a children's publisher, because then the other children's publisher was like, you have the word fuck 48 times in this book. Can you make it not 48? And that's when I made it 4. And I fought very hard to reduce the amount of fucks, not sex, but the word fuck. So the answer is I haven't actually found it that difficult, just because my approach to kind of sex and romance, it's like whenever people review the book from the romance community, they'll do the like spice-o-meter, you know, like how many chilies is it out of 5, and it would always be like 0 out of 5 chilies for spiciness, or like 1. I'm like, this is a 1 chili. I really put myself out of my comfort zone. 1 chili for spice. Although my sister read it yesterday and was texting me like gifs all day of like people fanning themselves. So I was like, please stop, this is so uncomfortable. like first of all, the book is dedicated to her, and second of all, like just the idea that my family would read this book is just one of the main reasons why I just like type things and then just absolutely delete them and go no. So great. Yes, it wasn't that big a jump is what I'm trying to say, because also I think that this book starts with a kind of sexy dream, but it's not necessarily like explicitly a sex dream. It's just a kind of sexy dream. I always feel like you can't, when you start a book with someone having a dream and they wake up from their dream and it's kind of like a secondary school writing exercise that you'd get 0 for. And that's what I did with this book. But in my head, it's okay, because I feel like most times in a YA book, they're not starting out having a sexy dream about a lady knight on a horse giving you a rose or whatever. That's the sexiest thing I can imagine.
But she has a sword and shit. Like, it's sexy. Sword and shit,
all sorts of stuff. Yeah. And we don't know where that dream went. I certainly am not going to ask. So yes, I've lost my thought.
That's okay.
The end. End of question.
End of thought.
Yeah.
But I think there is still something that is very radical about like queer pleasure and queer desire, even if it's not necessarily funneled through like the most anatomical of sex scenes, right? Like that can still be something that is unusual potentially for like children to read, and that can be part of their own kind of identity process, right? I
think also for me, like gender doesn't come into, a person's gender doesn't come into whether or not I'm attracted to them. And I think that the way that comes out in my books is a lot of the time that it's about kind of details like arms, hands and arms. There's a lot of hands and arms in my book. People are like, whoa, look at those arms. Just these little details, and like, I'm pretty sure I've written the word collarbone about 8 times in my books, because again, I think that's like the sexiest thing, is a collarbone and a wrist or whatever. And this is why I write historical. Like, the sexiest thing you can do is flash me a little wrist.
Little ankle.
Yeah, little ankle, sexy little ankle. So yeah, I feel like again, it's hard to know kind of like what teenagers will get out of your book, but like, I feel like the kind of, not degendering sounds bad, but for me, that is kind of what it is in my head, is they're just kind of removing, it's not about gender, it's about like the way that person rolls up their sleeves,
which is
sexy.
It is so sexy.
It's
that is
sexy.
The thing. Would you like to do a reading, and then we will take some audience questions?
Yes, although I will not be as good as you at
Thank
reading.
You. Oh my God.
First of all, you must know there is a map. Whoa. Ooh, yeah, thank you, everybody. The map, it doesn't make any sense, and you're not allowed to think about it. That's the rules. Okay. So this is, I don't even know why I described the dream part to you, because now you're going to hear all about it. When Gwen woke up, she knew she'd had the dream again, and that she'd been loud. See, this sounds bad now that I'm... It gets worse. Okay. She knew she'd had the dream because she was feeling exhilarated, loose-limbed, and a little flushed in the face. She knew she'd been vocal about it because Agnes, the dark-haired lady in waiting who slept in the adjoining chamber, kept biting her lip to keep from laughing and wouldn't look her in the eye. Agnes, Gwen said, sitting up in bed and fixing her with a very well-practiced and rather imperious look. Don't you have water to fetch or something? Yes, Your Highness, said Agnes, giving a little curtsy and then rushing from the room. Gwen sighed as she stared up at the bed hangings, lush velvet heavy with embroidery. It was probably a mistake to send her away so soon. She was young and flighty and would likely be off gossiping with anybody she encountered. At least Gwen's nocturnal exploits wouldn't stay top billing for long. Today was no ordinary day. Tournament season was finally upon them. Any mortifying morsels that Agnes slipped the other ladies in waiting would soon be forgotten in all the excitement. I'm literally editing this as I'm reading because I keep messing up what I'm about to say, so you're getting an interesting, never-before-read version of this book. When Agnes came back with a pitcher of water, Gwen stepped out of bed, raised her arms above her head so that Agnes could remove the thin tunic she slept in, and then stood yawning and blinking in the early morning light as she was scrubbed and oiled within an inch of her life. Agnes was just easing a new shift over Gwen's shoulders when the door was nudged open and a tall, pale, copper-haired young man walked in, his head buried in a stack of parchment. Have you seen this? He said, not lifting his eyes from the page. Gabriel, Gwen said, looking at him incredulously. I'm not dressed. Aren't you? Gabriel looked up and this is also, I'll talk about this in a second. Aren't you? Gabriel looked up and frowned at her briefly as if she had removed her clothes just to inconvenience him. Oh, sorry. The Greeks wrote a lot of plays about this sort of thing, Gwen said, as Agnes rushed over with a dress to cover her, her fair skin flushing a delicate pink. Her blushes were probably less to do with the impropriety of the situation and more to do with the fact that almost every woman at court harboured a persistent crush on her brother. Many had tried to catch his eye, and so far all had failed. He wasn't really one for talking at all unless it was to Gwen. She had always held this as a point of pride. The Greeks wrote a lot of plays about putting on dresses, he asked now, brow still furrowed, as Agnes yanked the dress inelegantly over Gwen's head. No, Gwen said, emerging with quite a lot of her hair stuck to her mouth. You're missing are you even listening to me? You walked into my room, you know. He turned over the piece of parchment he was reading to peruse the other side, not acknowledging that he'd heard a word. Gabriel, Gabe, can you hear something? The sound of a spectral voice upon the air. It almost sounds like I'm talking. Hang on, G, he said, raising a hand to indicate that he needed a moment. Gwen considered this, decided he hadn't earned it. Ow. Gwen had taken one of the brocade slippers Agnes had offered to her and thrown it at him with considerable force. Please arrive at the point with haste. Fine, Gabriel said, still rubbing his head. Father is having me look at the accounts with Lord Stafford, costs for the tournament season mostly. But I also saw this and I thought... He trailed off, handing her the parchment so she could read it for herself. Agnes started expertly weaving Gwen's long red hair into braids as Gwen's eyes skimmed quickly down the page, taking in an extensive list of assets. Chests full of silks and damask, an ancient jewelry dining set. Oh, no, I'm getting all this wrong. An ancient jeweled dining set. Endless porcelain vases, all marked to be leaving the crown's coffers in the coming months. Comprehension dawned as she reached the end of the page and the entry denoting the enormous biblical tapestry of Ruth and Naomi that currently hung in her chambers. This is my dowry, she said slowly. Gabe, my dowry. I suppose it's that time already, Gabriel said with a sympathetic grimace. Shit, said Gwen, sitting down heavily at the end of the bed. Shit, Gabriel agreed. What I was going to say is that I had a note on this early on that just from my editor that just said, is this a bit incesty? And I was like, I don't think so. It's probably fine. And obviously there is a joke in there about the Greeks, so it's all fine.
It's
It's not that kind of book, just so we all know. Yes, we hope it's self-aware.
That was beautiful, thank you.
Thanks, it was fine, wasn't it?
It was.
It was mid, but it's okay, we can all admit that.
All right, lads, it is over to you. Who has questions? And I think Christina has, God bless you, a roving mic.
Oh my God, a roving mic.
A roving mic.
Hello. Thank you very much for the talk. That's really exciting. I have two questions, if that's cheeky. Okay. So one question for you is, you mentioned that you're kind of not over, but just kind of evolving away from Regency. Do you have any idea in terms of what's kind of next in terms of an era or just, a topic that you'd like to cover? A second one is a bit more like thinking about romance in terms, or just like genre in general, in terms of like you kind of straddle between adult romance and young adult. Are you kind of noticing a trend in terms of we're moving away from genre and more just a book is a book? So it's a bit of an open question. Thank you.
Those are a good question. Let's see if I can remember them. The first one was my brain. Do you remember the first one?
Oh God.
No. It was you're moving away from Regency.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. So I have another book, another YA book that will be out probably at some point next year, which is again a kind of like faux medieval, like fun fantasy historical, playing with like another kind of big mythological person from medieval history. And every time I say that, I'm just like, there's not that many. You can probably guess who it is. And after that, I don't know. I kind of want to write some books in space, but apparently nobody wants to read space books. And
Really?
I love space books. This is what's wild to me, okay, is that the publishing industry will be like, there's no market for that. And then I ask any room full of people, like, would you read a queer book on a spaceship? Everyone's like, yeah, obviously. So who knows what's going on. I don't know what I don't really know what I'll be doing after that. I've got a bunch of ideas, but I think like in terms of historical, I have had so many people be like, the word pothole wasn't invented until like 6 months after you set this book. I actually had one reviewer that was just like, this type of gun is incorrect. You've used the wrong model of gun. And I was just like, okay. So I feel like I have reached a point, like I'm a very kind of stubborn person, and first of all, I just react against it by getting even more, like even less accurate. People will be like, this isn't historically accurate. I'm like, you think that wasn't historically accurate? Just you wait. But I also feel like I've reached a point where the thing that's fun about the YA is that because it's in a fantasy historical setting, I can just kind of, the thing that no one seems to have noticed in Gwen and Art is that they're drinking tea. Like no one brings that up. And I think actually it's interesting. It's about how we kind of, not to start my TED talk again, I think how we think of historical fiction is often like, something has to feel historical, even if it's not historically accurate. And the thing about medieval historical is that if it was written to be accurate to the time, it would not read like kind of Victorian historical fiction, which is the historical fiction voice that we're most comfortable and kind of familiar with. It would be in like Middle English or something, and it would be just incomprehensible. I had to do a Middle English unit at university, and I think it literally nearly got me kicked off the course. What was the question? Oh yeah, books. I'll write some more books. We'll see. But I'm basically sick of having to Google like origin of the word okay, because it's just I've reached a point where I want to kind of move past that a little bit. But never say never. I have no idea. And then your other question was about a book being a book. See, I retained one piece of information. I do think that is how I feel. I often feel like I write something and then I get told later like what it is. So I'm trying to write YA. It's definitely upper end YA, I think. And again, that's not because of the sexual content, because we all know that to me it's an ankle. Yeah. And actually, it's not because of the drugs either. No one takes any drugs in that book. It's more just that I think I am mostly writing for an audience that's kind of around the age of like 18 and up most of the time, not because of adult themes, but just because that's where I'm imagining the kind of the reader. You asked me earlier who I was writing for. I was like, no one. Apparently I do know who I'm thinking about writing. 18-year-olds. But I love reading YA, and I think I know like lots of adults love reading YA. So I think I don't want to just be writing for like adults who read YA. I also want to be writing for the kids who read the YA. But I definitely just kind of, I haven't ever had them say this isn't really appropriate, apart from when they were like incesty. Most of the time that they're just kind of like, yeah, sure, why not? These teenagers can be doing this. So I just write what I want to write and see what happens. Thank you for your questions.
Do we have any others? There is one here, Christina, and then one there. So whichever is more accessible to you.
We could play past the microphone. I'm sure people would help if that was needed. You have to do a little dance as you cross the stage. I'll do a little dance.
I'm feeling a lot of pressure for it to be a good question.
I know, there was so much build up. We should have done the like, ooh.
Drum roll. So you were talking about the packaging of, I always forget book names because I just open them and like drink. Was it Reputation, the first
Reputation
one?
was the first Regency one,
So you talk about the packaging of that and how when you got the book deal, like Bridgerton wasn't yet the really big thing. And we were talking as we sat down about how like Bridgerton meets Mean Girls makes it sound like it's just like fun and frothy. Not that there's anything wrong with just fun and frothy, but actually it's really incisive commentary on classism and the structures of Regency England. That's making me sound like I've written an essay on it. I haven't yet.
This. It makes me feel smart just listening to you.
So when the deal originally happened, was the packaging going to be different than it ended up being, or was it not yet fully formed by the time the Bridgerton massive happened?
Well, as you may have noticed, they copied the Bridgerton poster for the cover of Reputation because they were like, that's what we want to do, is kind of make that connection. That's how we sell books. And I do think what's interesting is that an author is quite removed from that process. You do have a bit of input on your cover. And if you're a very, very famous author, then you have a lot more input on how your book is marketed. But if you are mid-list, so not a lead title, then most of the time you're just kind of, you might have a little bit of input, but you just have to kind of go along with what the publisher what the publisher wants. So I don't think it was really fully formed at that point. They bought the book obviously thinking they would do something with it, but I don't know what they thought they were going to do with it. And Bridgerton came along, they were like, that's what we'll do with it. But you are right that it's not super light and fluffy. Like, I hope the books are funny because I measure all my self-worth by if people think I'm funny or not. Thanks for laughing. But they are all, because I think I said earlier, like coming of age stories. So they do have, the themes of kind of drugs, and there's some quite heavy stuff that I have. There's content warnings for them, I put them on the Goodreads page before there's reviews, and then I run away. And I also put them on my website just because I do want people to know that they're not these kind of super light, fluffy books. And while they have their kind of high fun points, literally high in the first book's case. One person laughed, thank you so much. I'll pay you later for that. It's difficult. And what's really interesting is that the Infamous, my second book, my mic's coming out, isn't it? My second book, Infamous, has a bright yellow cover and is about people in autumn, as it's getting into winter, going to a poet's private island, and then everything just sort of falling apart around them. And it's meant to be very gothic, and it can be quite heavy at times. And you just go with the flow with what the publisher does, basically. I'm going to try, okay, wait, what have I done here? This is fun, isn't it? Is that better? We don't know. Impossible to say. So the answer to your question, the very long-winded answer to your question, is that I don't know what the plan was. I think Bridgerton came along and kind of saved the day a bit in terms of they were like, oh, that's what it's going to be. But you don't really get much of a say in it. You just kind of go with the flow. But I'm still very grateful to Bridgerton for giving me money personally.
Thank you to Shonda Rhimes.
Exactly.
I think, yes, there was one here. Tina?
Thank you. First of all, I think the sword fighting scene in Gwen Not between Gwen and Lady Claire is 5 out of 5 chilies. So
I did try. It's actually really funny because someone said to me, like, do you have a moment where someone tips up someone else's chin with the tip of a sword? And I was like, I do. Anyway.
And the question was, I really like the humour and the banter in your books, and as well, like you talked about Tams and Muir. Like I feel like even though they're really different genres, a book is a book. And yeah, the humour in it is quite similar, and I feel like it reminds me of Casey McQuiston as well. And I just wondered if you had like any other authors that you think of when you think of like that humour in Tamsin Muir and Casey McQuiston and what you're trying to do.
What I find really interesting is that Casey tweeted once something that I was like, this explains everything. They tweeted saying, like, you aren't born with a sense of humour. You read Louise Rennison's Roger Nicholson books, and you develop a sense of humour. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. Should I take it off? Is that better?
You take the hand mic.
Is there a hand mic?
Oh.
Oh, so smart. Yes, I can take the hand mic.
So basically, it's Louise Rennison's fault. Although I was rereading those books very recently, and every time I do, I'm like, oh, good Lord, the things that she says. Like, it's not that it's not accurate to what we were all saying when we were like 9 or whatever, but oh my God, it's awful. Anyway, so I feel like a lot of the time that sense of humor like really specifically developed from either being chronically online, and like the Tams and Muir thing is just like, grew up on Tumblr, like grew up watching all these like, you know, ridiculous videos and all of those references. I mean, some of them, the nun pizza with left beef, I don't know if anyone, good Lord, that was the one I was like, oh, you're flying so close to the sun. You're girl bossing too close to the sun there. Anyway, that wasn't your question. I mean, I guess what I was saying was that I feel like the Louise Renison books were kind of like, and there's a kind of absurdist humor. I think sometimes the Alexis Hall books, I don't know if anyone's read like Boyfriend Material, his books often have that kind of quite absurd, like it's almost Woodhouse, like it's that just weird, dialed up sense of humor that I'm always kind of trying to go for. And it does sometimes get a bit farcical. I generally try and stay away from like all out farce, but yeah, ultimately I just feel like it is quite millennial humor as well, and it reaches the point where I'm like, the kids are going to start bullying me for my millennial humor, and I'll deserve it. I can't think of any other books right now. Casey McQuiston is a good reference because I'll say I want to be them. Yeah, don't know. I'll come back to you personally. I'll just tweet you later.
We probably have time for one very quick question.
No pressure.
If there is one. I think there is one here, maybe? Oh no, sorry. Oh, did I miss? Okay, maybe we have time for 2 very quick questions.
Oh, it's just the pressure. I'm like,
oh, okay.
Sorry, that wasn't that I didn't want to ask a question. I was just like, oh God, I've not even fully formed it in my mind.
It's like, what did I do?
I know. Okay, I hope this makes sense then. So I've read Reputation, and I know we're talking about the chiliometer in terms of like, you know, romance and spiciness. But you were talking before about beats in romance writing. And there's some lovely scenes, I think, with the love interests in Reputation, which are really vulnerable, and they talk a lot about grief as well, which I hope I'm really selling it to people because it is excellent. But honestly. But do you see like that kind of vulnerability and those expressions of vulnerability as also being like a necessary beat in romance writing? Because we talk about light and fluffy, and that's great, but I think, yeah, do you find that's also necessary when writing romance?
Now I will sit quietly while I wait. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think, yay! I think that people, when they're writing, talk a lot about like character wound. Like, what's the character's wound? Because like that's the thing that you're carrying around with you, and it informs the way. I say with you, now we're all doing group therapy. It informs the way that the character feels about themselves. It informs like what they think they deserve, what they think they need. And I do think that these kind of, moments of vulnerability, and it doesn't always have to be like the sharing of a tragic backstory, although it often ends up being like that. But I do just think like being able to open up and being able to have those really intimate conversations, like I'm not going to say it's sexy because, you know, it's not necessarily about it being sexy, but yeah, like creating that deeper connection, I think like is a really core part of that journey. And I think you can also tell sometimes in books when people just go, and now it's time for the vulnerable backstory moment. And they just have their little moment. And I feel like it has to really be kind of woven in, like that kind of like vulnerability and the core beliefs that a character has about themselves have to be so woven into the story that it kind of informs everything they do. And you can go, oh, this makes sense of why this person relates to people in that way, or why they struggle with this type of relationship. Very much in the way that we all examine ourselves and do in therapy. I like how I'm saying that like we're all in therapy. I'm not even in therapy. Clearly there's a problem with me right now. I said to my therapist, I'm just going to have a break and then I'll come back. Didn't come back. So I've got a lot to talk about with my next therapist. Anyway, I hope that answers your question. Just revealing a lot about myself today. Like when I realized I was going to be the only panelist, I was like, okay, then we're going all in.
Got to fill an hour.
Exactly. We did it, though.
We actually did. I am so proud of us.
Whoa.
So yeah, I think that is all that we have time for. Thank you so much to the Scottish Storytelling Centre for having us. Thank you to all of you for witnessing our collective breakdown.
Thank you for not
as
leaving.
it was happening.
The moment you realised it was just me, I was actually going to say, if anyone wants to leave, this is your 5-minute grace period.
You stayed, which was so lovely.
Thank you for staying. Big ego boost for me.
And thank you so much to Lex for being a trooper.
Thank you to you.
So there are Lex's books, Lola's books, and Adiba's books upstairs. And is there a signing, Christina? There is a signing with Lex also upstairs. So yeah, on you go.
I'll be there. Thank you.